I'm Bill Dutton. I see a lot of new faces here. Very want to welcome you, and this is sort of a bittersweet moment, I think, because first of all, we're always delighted when Ted Nelson is speaking at the OII, and he always brings people who are not necessarily regulars to the OII, but it's wonderful to have you here. But it's also a sad occasion because Ted is going back to the States at the end of the month with Marlene, and we'll miss both Marlene Malikat and Ted Nelson. I always think of Ted for the first time I read his work back in '74 when I was doing research on this social impacts of the internet, of the computing and telecommunications. We didn't have the term internet at that time, but it was Computer Lib and Dream Machines, the book that was so exciting and got so many people interested in the potential of computing. And but if you ask Ted, and as all of you who know Ted, you realize that he never talks about that. He's always talking about what he's doing lately. You know, most academics you have to push them to say, "What are you doing? What have you done lately?" Ted is always working on the next thing. And it's always been great to have him at the OII. He always forces us to think about how the web could be better, how the internet could have been better, and that kind of analytical skepticism about what we take for granted as the way in which the web or the internet should work, will work, is something he brings to the OII. We'll miss that. Hopefully you'll continue to be involved with the OII, even from the States, and that we'll get you back on occasion.
Sure.
But now I will get out of the way. We have 2 hours, I believe.
Yeah.
But we have a reception at 5 o'clock, and so hopefully we can have informal discussion. At the end, if we have time for questions, we'll have a mic, and so we'll pass that around. Okay,
Good.
Ted.
Thank you
very much.
Well, I want to thank everybody, first of all, Bill, the OII, especially my partner, Marlene, and a whole lot of friends in Nottingham, Southampton, and here in Oxford for everything that's going on. And our colleague Rob Smith, who's the lead programmer in what we're doing now. But this is going to be kind of this talk will be different. Because over the last decades, I've had to speak in the voice of a social scientist or the voice of a computer guy, and it's never the big picture. And the big picture is very big. And having to narrow it to the context of particular academic disciplines is narrowing to the mind. I'm just going to talk about what I've tried to be and what I've tried to do over the years and why I'm still doing it. I never had any identity problem. When I was 14, I typed up a little card that said, Ted Nelson, nexialist. I had found the word in a book called The Voyage of the Space Beagle, a science fiction novel by A.E. Van Vogt, and he defined nexialist as someone who finds connections. I've been tracking on that. Then 2 years later, when I was 16, I signed up for a speed reading course, and they handed me a form to fill out that asked my occupation. Well, I was damned if I was going to say student. So I thought a little, and I wrote poet, philosopher, and rogue. And apparently I'm still tracking on that as well. A few years ago I got a medal in Paris, and to my astonishment, the Minister of Culture said, "Vous êtes philosophe et poète." Wow, how did she know? Had she been in touch with the speed reading company? So I'll try to throw in a little philosophy and poetry. The roguery perhaps is diffuse. I don't feel like a rogue so much as trying to make people see the truth and that seems roguish to some. I was raised by my grandparents and my great-grandparents. My grandparents were very literary, and they helped me enlarge my vocabulary as fast as my little mouth could run. And my great-grandfather, a retired science teacher, told me about the Doppler shift and the precession of the equinoxes and astronomy and all kinds of things. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. And I asked questions all day long, and they answered them all day long. Very few children have that privilege of people who are willing, let alone able, to give first-order answers to all the questions of a child. I remember when I was visiting in rural Georgia in 1963, and some child asked, "Gee, I wonder how far away the stars are," and his mother said, "Oh, how you do go on with your silly questions." And that made me very sad. Now, that's my grandparents. My parents were young actors who were divorced when I was born. My grandfather made them stay married until I was born so that I would be legitimate, which was a legitimate concern in those days. And from them, who I saw from time to time, obviously separately, I learned many things. My mother was on Broadway and later in films, and so I got to go backstage on Broadway and meet a few famous actors, and see the Fox lot. I think I still have the pictures I took of the Fox lot, the late lamented Fox lot in LA when I was 12. And my father, both of my parents were very hard driving and very talented and clever, though neither was intellectual in any sense. And my father wrote a hit play on Broadway while he was a flight instructor in the state of Georgia, which is pretty good. It was Kirk Douglas's first part. And when my father got out of the Army, because the Air Force was still in the Army at the time, he entered a new field called television. And I got to sit behind him in control rooms. Now, the control room was very interesting. You see, it had a big window looking out on the studio, so you saw part of the sets, and but you were acoustically isolated. And my father had an intercom. When he had been at NBC, the director was not allowed to talk to the cameraman. I sat with somebody on an airplane in the late 90s, and I mentioned this, and he said, "Yep, that rule was just changed 40 years later." So that was the principal reason my father left NBC, and then he was directing at CBS, where he was able to talk to the cameraman if he needed to, and I was sitting behind him that night when camera one went out. Camera one was the big one, the one that went up and down. And my father had to talk the show through. Okay, camera two to the kitchen, camera three to the front porch, camera two to the front porch, camera three to the kitchen. And he did this seamlessly. When it was over, the control room erupted in applause. The producers, the lighting guys, everybody there, because he had saved the show. It wouldn't have been his fault if he hadn't. But you couldn't do that at CBS, but he had the presence of mind. He had both the military orientation and a showbiz orientation. So the main thing I learned was that new media are born. Television was being invented. So, for example, the month or the year they invented split screen, NBC got a patent on split screen, which meant that the scan lines from two different sources could be broken in the middle, so you'd have a picture from one camera on the left, a picture from one camera on the right. Trivial now. This was a big deal in 1949 or 50. So my father had a show. He had a weekly heartwarming family comedy show called Mama. On one of the shows, he had Mama and one of the aunts talking on the phone, and it was split screen. And immediately he got a call from his friend at NBC saying, "How did you do that?" well, of course, the actresses were standing 6 inches apart. He was also a prankster. After each dress rehearsal, there were what were called producer's notes. And that meant that the producer or the producer's representative came and bothered the director with a long list of junky fixes that he wanted put in before the actual show, which would be 2 hours later. And that would mean sitting with the actors and going through them all, they would promise to do it, and blah, 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 blah. So from sources I've seen, this is still a nuisance. So my father would always play a prank in the dress rehearsal, sometimes a little one, sometimes a big one. He had me on a show in the summer of '58, on a shipboard, Romance it was. I was just a walk-on, but at the end, under the closing titles, he showed the Andrea Doria sinking, implying that the whole ship had sunk, and obviously changing the story somewhat. So he then started his stopwatch, as he liked to do when he played his prank, to see how long it would take the producer's representative to reach him, and then would allow the producer's representative to plead him out of this inspiration for 5 or 10 minutes until finally he would agree not to do it, after which all the other notes were forgotten. It was a very useful technique. Anyway, so new media were born. They were changing all the time. And this was obvious because, of course, even in the 20th century, we'd had telephony. Well, that was before the turn of the century and the others. But movies and telephones and radio all grew to their new height in the 20th century, and television was just one more of these. And then at the same time, 47, 48, 49, out came the long-playing record, which changed which went back to a previous recording standard of 33 RPM, and out came the 45 RPM single, competing with one another. So all of these things were changing. It was perfectly familiar to me. Now, you could say I was always a bit sophisticated. For example, when I was 10, I could have told you who had coined the words chortle, tintinnabulate, serendipity, and I wanted to know everything about words. I want to know every word in the language. Of course, that's systematically impossible. But I wanted to know everything about every subject. And I didn't accept the way things were taught or explained. Now, wanting to know everything is perhaps a youthful attitude. Perhaps it's a way to keep on looking young. Perhaps a way to live forever, I don't know. But where will you learn everything? Surely not in school. In my harsher moments, I used to speak of schools as a system for systematically destroying people's minds. I would amend that and say, for systematically aligning people's minds so they all think alike. This helps communication. It fosters the ability to work together, and it crumples originality. It crumples the ability to see and observe. By the time I was 11 or 12, I was embittered. I didn't like middle-class life and putting on a show. We had an elevator in our apartment building. You had to sort of stand facing front and talk about the weather. I thought this was so artificial and awful. And I thought there would be better ways to live. Surely there would be better equipment to live. One of my first things I sent for when I was 5 or 6 was a projector gun. I was so excited, I thought I'd have a whole movie theater, and it was this little dopey thing that had 16 millimeter film and a AA battery. It was hugely disappointing. Then when I was, I guess, 7 or 8, I became enthralled by a product called kangaroo spring shoes. They had long springs. And obviously this would allow me to take great leaps and to go down the block at double the speed. So I put them on and immediately sprained both ankles very badly. Later in graduate school, partly inspired by Disney's movie Make Mine Music, which had a character named Bongo the Bear who rode around, I think it was Make Mine Music, rode around on a unicycle. I thought, that's the way, that's so much more practical than a bicycle. So in graduate school, I bought a unicycle, and it's preposterously hard to ride, and you can't carry anything, and it was a, well, I wouldn't say it was a mistake, it was a learning experience, but it was, you know, I later, when I first visited Doug Engelbart, one of the people in his office persuaded me that skateboards were the way to go. So I got a skateboard when I was 40 and learned to do that a little bit, and that wasn't very practical either. I keep looking for they now have electric skateboards. She won't let me get one. They have a remote, would you believe? So you stand there in a fencing position, one foot facing forward, 1 foot facing sideways with the remote in your hand. And it has, as you know, electrical vehicles have tremendous acceleration. Anyway. When I was 10, one of my great heroes was Frank Lloyd Wright. Still is. And I heard about his house, Falling Water, which is built around a stream. And I was just thrilled by this. I thought the stream went through the living room. I only found out a couple of years ago, nah, it just goes around it. But it was, so I was very disappointed. But from that, I got to thinking about having an underwater house and getting all enthralled about that. So it's always seemed to me that things would be so much better if they were different. Now that the ratio of change to improvement there is what's to be considered. Movies were my religion. When I was little, we lived in Chicago, right next to a block from the Esquire Theater, which is still standing as one of the great Art Deco palaces. And there I saw the first run of Bambi, second run of Snow White, first run of Fantasia, and a couple of others. And Disney was my god. And I think he's now considerably underrated in the backlash. But studying movies and the effects and how they were made, I thought about it all the time. When I was 15, I got my own copy of the American Cinematographer Handbook. And that was about the year of a film called When Worlds Collide. When Worlds Collide was incredibly moving to me because it told of a perilous moment where the Earth is about to be hit by a great celestial object. Well, this was considered fantastical then. Now we know it happens from time to time. In fact, it was going to be hit by two. The first one would be the warning, which would cause tidal waves, and the second would destroy the planet. And so a crash course, a crash project is created to create a breeding planet, a breeding population off the planet. We must escape. And the calendar is a character in this movie. Every day the page turns, one day closer to the end. And there's a great effect where they flooded Times Square as the first planet went by. How did they do this? Well, they made a miniature Times Square of all the shapes of the buildings. They painted the blocks of these buildings black. Then they released a large amount of water, I think it's probably the size of this room, into that space, photographing it as they went, speeding up the camera so that the ratio of the movement of the water to the space would be correct when the film was appropriately slowed down. Then they made masks, a male and a female mask, for films of actual Times Square showing the cars, and showing the cars and the buildings, so that it would appear as though, when they printed these together in a sandwich, it would appear as though the water were obscuring the cars and the buildings. I tell you that in summary, simply to say that this was what I was studying. This was my deepest interest. How do you do these things? If you had asked me at 15, if you told me about the matrix cam, all right, in the matrix cam, somebody leaps in the air and then the camera goes around them frozen. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. It's easy. It wouldn't be electronic and it wouldn't be digital, but All you need is a whole bunch of cameras and one strobe. So the point is that when you start to think like this, the relation of action to framing to presentational structure, you're thinking like a director. You're thinking about how it all fits together and what is the purpose. The purpose is the effect on the mind and heart of the viewer. And the mechanism you choose to affect the heart and mind of the viewer, these are the director's prerogative and the budget's constraints. So, I went to college and I took charge. See, they have this thing called the curriculum, this traditional thing called the curriculum. And that is exactly what's wrong with education in my mind. People try to create better curricula. They're just going around the same problem, because what does curriculum mean? It means, in Latin, racetrack. And you're creating a racetrack where you are assigning the things to be learned to a timetable, which is probably not optimal. Now, curricula are also products of political fighting, so that creating a new curriculum is a tremendous thing of committee fights and blah, and blah, and blah, but why have it at all? The objective is education, yes? What is the best way to get people educated is to motivate them. What is the best way to take away motivation? The curriculum. What is the right order in which to learn history? I ask rhetorically, and obviously the answer is any way at all is fine. So perhaps the right order is the way the person wants to, is the order in which the person is interested. Because it's far more interesting that way. How many people do you know who say they hated history in school and then found out later how interesting it was? Yeah. Yeah. I didn't ask you to show that, but it came anyway. Yes, thank you. So school is a system for ruining different subjects for you, and the last subject to be ruined determines your profession. So why should this be? So take history. See, I'm not arguing for the Summerhill guitars on the lawn thing. I'm saying, let's create testable requirements, but allow the student to choose the order, manner, sequence, style in which it shall be learnt. Now you see, one of the problems there is that an important function of the curriculum is to keep the academic persons occupied so they can be paid. And to utilize the buildings optimally. And to keep all the secretaries busy. And where would we be without all that? I don't know. I think it has to start with an experimental school in California, obviously. But it can be done. Anyway, so when I went to college, they had this thing of requiring a major. Well, in my first 2 years, I tried about 5 different majors. Obviously, no, I was not interested in English literature, it turned out, nor in psychology. And they didn't teach sociology, so that retained for me a romantic fascination because I thought that would be where the truth would lie. Ended up in philosophy. But I took courses in the hot new stuff that nobody knew about in the standard curricula. The Whorfian hypothesis had just come out then, that language affects our thinking. And because it wasn't taught, it was much more romantic and exciting. And I managed to get a reading course in that and anthropology stuff. So I managed to cover a lot of different things before I settled down. And after that, I majored in extracurriculars because I figured this was the one opportunity I would have to do all kinds of stuff that would be very difficult outside. So I managed in my college years to produce a long-playing record, to write the first rock musical, Here's the program for it. Printed just 50 years ago this year. I wrote to some auction house in London that claims to sell rock memorabilia online and said, can we monetize the last 2 virgin copies of the LP? And they didn't even reply. Not canonical, not on the list. So, yeah, I produced a long playing record, and then finally, a movie. Oh, let me show you bits of that. I'm rather proud of it. It came about in a strange way. My roommate, Tony Poole, and I were going to, we managed to get a $700 grant from the Student Council to make a film, and we started wrangling about the script. He would write it, I would direct it, but then what he was planning to write didn't suit what I wanted to do. But anyway, we were arguing about it, and then abruptly, he died. And this was a terrible shock. He's my best friend, and so I shelved the project. But then, a few weeks before finals, when one is looking for things to do, it occurred to me, I had $700 to make a movie. He would have wanted me to. No time to write a script. Okay, I'll make it up as I go along. And since we'd be fitting the soundtrack on afterward, I'll just have the actors say, parp, parp, parp. And that'll be funny, like Huckleberry Hound. Well, I like what I did, and it's very atmospheric, but a lot of people can't relate to the parp, parp, parp. I was thinking I'd put it on the net and make it seem as if it were scanned at a very low rate. So I'll just run a couple of pieces of that while we talk. So it was atmospheric, and the interesting thing was that a character emerged out of it, and that wasn't me, and it wasn't the actor. It was somebody else. A nice character, a character you like. So the other thing I started doing in college was taking notes, taking serious notes. Because I'll just let it run for a minute. Okay. I'll have to stand over here so you'll look at me. The other thing I started doing in college was taking serious notes, because I saw that other people vaguely remembered things and half remembered things, and were all wrong about lots of facts. And I said, I don't want to be that way. I want to get things right. I want to remember things correctly. And so I started taking serious notes on every subject that interested me, little knowing where this would go. So by the end of college, I had, that many notes on 4x6 cards. Little did I know. And I've gone on doing that because it's a way of putting stakes in the ground for learning different subjects. If you remember one thing, that's more than remembering nothing. And if you remember several things about a field, well, that begins to be a little something of an impression. It may be trivial, but it's as much as lots of other people know about the field. And from time to time, I've been very pleased that I knew things other people didn't. One time I actually told a master of an Oxford college something he didn't know about his own field. So this is a pleasure, and it's fascinating to know things. It's just fascinating. But the more you know, the greater the boundary of the unknown. So you never feel like you know everything. It's exactly the opposite. Knowledge is fractal. There are big lumps and little lumps, and they're all shaped the same, with uncertainty at every edge. Information is fractal. Disagreement is fractal. The whole world of ideas is this whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have any structure. People put hierarchy on it since Aristotle because it's convenient or because they want to. But the actual structure of the ideas goes in all directions. And that is the fascinating part. Now, for example, I'll kill this. Now, I'm going to sing you a song from the musical because it's so. I only noticed lately how well it expresses academic mores. This is a content-free song about a content-free seminar paper. It can be seen as looked upon from different points of view. It can be seen as looked upon from different points of view. I will try to clarify this and thereby to verify this to whatever small extent I may be able to so do. Ooh, ooh. This outlook in the setup of the concepts I express shows a tendency to take us in an infinite regress. Since the framework of the viewpoint somehow seems to have dissolved the bifurcated status of dichotomies involved, it can be seen, etc. The division of the subject is connoted by the way that the categories here may lead the neophyte astray. So let me state a fact the which you yet may know not of, as I have stated earlier in what I said above. It can be seen as looked upon from different points of view. It can be seen as looked upon from different points of view. I think that I have proved it in a manner that behooved it, and in doing so have shown that I was able to so do. Ooh, ooh. Starting from that basis of understanding, I should have known better than to try to get into academia. Because that expresses, I think, far too well many aspects of the academic world as I still know it. But the problem is that the truth is out there, and some of it is known by scholars. And one can't quite stay away. Now, the same year I wrote, in my junior year, I wrote that musical, and by the way, just for credit, the songs, the tunes were written by Richard Kaplan, but essentially to my spec. But I wrote and directed it, and it was much too long, and unfortunately, the cast outnumbered the audience. Having 75 people in the cast was not intelligent. The second main thing I did that year is I became wildly inspired. I got philosophically inflated with what I can now state as the insight that everything can be expressed in terms of graph structure. Now, I'd never heard of graph structure. Didn't hear of it that year either. But I tried to put this into a term paper, which is reprinted in my PhD thesis, which endeavored to solve all the philosophical problems and create a generalized representational structure for all ideas, and therefore happens to be at exactly the same time as the other knowledge representation work that I knew nothing about at the time. So it was of its time, though independently inspired. And I've gone on thinking about that stuff. I can't get it out of my mind. The way I've developed it has had very little to do with the way it's developed in the academic community, and I don't know when or whether I will ever have a chance to write it up and publish it, because it's extremely difficult. So in 1959, when I was graduating from college, I was in a quandary. I couldn't choose between show business and intellect. And as I said, I was unaware of the things that I would really hate about academia, which would have put me off. But I believed I could analyze anything, I could design anything, and I could show anything. My father had offered to help me become an actor, but I didn't think I had the talent. And at the same time, I made this little movie, and I thought, wow, that's what I'm best at. That's what I want to do. But there's still stuff I've got to know. So I went to graduate school. And that was extremely horrible. I was at the University of Chicago for a year. Now, to encapsulate it, the temperature is roughly 10 below much of the winter. The university has 1,000 women and 11,000 men. And the experience was quite horrible. Second year I went to Harvard, and I took a course in computers. Now I ask rhetorically, with your heart in show business and your head in academia, what do you do? Answer, you invent hypertext and hypermedia. Because I looked at them, here they were presenting this thing as a calculating engine and then saying, well, we can also do text analysis with it. I said, wait a minute. A program can do anything, and you can put a screen on it. That's it. That's it. That's the future of the human race. All of human work will go to the computer screen. Now, at this time, there were about under 100 computer screens in the world. Most of them had either NORAD or missile defense or air traffic control. But at the same time, the principle was absolutely clear. Moore's law was in place. Moore's law had not been stated as such, but it was perfectly clear. So when I saw you could put screens on them, my head exploded. This was the future of the human race. A different kind of life, self-publishing. See, I hated publishers. I came from my grandmother self-published, my great-grandfather self-published. It seemed to me the right way to go. William Blake self-published. Hey, come on. I later worked for a big publisher, and they said, well, self-publishing is vanity publishing. Excuse me. All publishing is vanity publishing. So I thought, since the computer screen is going to replace paper in every aspect, we must create an entire system, an entire complete new universe parallel to the old that takes care of versioning, publishing, annotation, publishing of marginal notes, and ways to sell content legitimately within the copyright system. Later, in the decades after that, all the geeks have said, oh, well, copyright is over because we can make copies. That's like saying that life is over because we can shoot people. I had my own copyright certificates from my freshman year. There was no question. I knew people who lived by their writers. No question that copyright's going to go on politically. So how do we handle this in the most politically magnanimous gracious, win-win system? And the answer seemed to me obvious. You pay, not for a whole book at a time, but for the next screen full that you send for. And who gets it? Well, obviously, some of it has to go to the service provider. Again, I was guessing as to what the form of transmission would be, but since there would be digital transmission, that was assured. Since there would be digital transmission, some of it would go to pay for the digital transmission, and some would go to pay for the document to those who stored it and to those who created it. But instead of the book being the unit, now we would go to different units, but not only that, just the next screen full as you continued in the document. Now, what did that mean? It meant it's like not buying wine by the glass, buying wine by the sip is just as valid a form of commerce. It's just very different. But what would that mean that was beneficial? It would simplify the problem of quotation and permission. I had already tried to get permission to reprint something and saw what a can of worms that was. So, instead of having to negotiate permission to reprint or to reuse something, all you do in this postulated future system is you put a pointer in. If you wish to include something in your document from some other document, you put a pointer in that brings it in from the legitimate sales source of that piece. So it is seamlessly purchased by the user. It's absolutely fair. It all adds up. Nothing is delivered that isn't paid for. And the user gets to keep it. Now, I'm giving you a simplified view because this has gone through many different stages, but this has always been basically the idea. So now we're getting there, aren't we? We're keeping documents, but we're still doing them as whole units. Quotability is not yet on anybody's horizon, and that is the central problem. So legitimate quotability. Now people say, well, you've got fair use. What about that? Fair use is different. Fair use means you can use a certain amount, little bits. I'm talking about big bits, big chunks. So the present version of this is called transcopyright. I have a patent on it, which I recently sold, but I retain the rights to use it. And this will allow the sale of content on the web with automatic payment to the rights holder, to many rights holders as you go along. But the whole point was you had to have a complete system that did all of this. You had to have ways of overlaying any document. Get back to this. So people would say to me, for the next 2 decades, they'd say to me, but are you a computer scientist? What has that got to do with it? This is all obvious. And in fact, the computer scientists, a lot of them are clucks and obsessed with completely unimportant things. What do they teach them? What is the tradition of teaching first in computer science? In computer science, recursive programming, which is absolutely useless. But it's a way of saying, we're scientists here, we don't care if it's useful. And the computer scientists I talked to in 1960 and after, they couldn't get it on their horizon that people would be reading and writing from screens. They'd say, oh, well, we'll look for relevance of queries. That was one. That was, what's his name at Harvard. And I'm not saying this is illicit work, it's just that it wasn't getting to what I thought was the center. And so every computer scientist I talked to about this during the 1960s came up with some bozoid response. And so it's not about computer science. It's not about computer science. It's about documents. It's about civilization, for God's sake. It's about what kind of a civilization we're going to have. And right now we're living... Calm down. So how could Nelson know this? He wasn't a computer scientist. I was a movie maker. What is the computer with a screen on it? It's a movie machine. It's a special effects box. Okay, how do you do special effects? Well, you look at all the possibilities, with cameras, framing, What's the cheapest way to make a monster? Have a picture of a person reacting. Ah! Okay, so these are all options. Now, what does the computer do on the screen? It goes down a list of shapes and letters and puts them on the screen in the places you've specified. That's all it is, but entangled with further and further complications. So this is not a hard concept, or it wasn't a hard concept. It was a hard concept for a lot of people, but it really wasn't, you see. So this problem of putting documents on the screen was the same problem as flooding times square. You figure out how to do it, and you do it. So I had been wondering what really was my destiny in life, and it became very clear. I had to design the documents of the future, because if I didn't, the techies would screw it up. And I believe that is exactly what has happened. And so now we live in a world of screwed up documents. So my plan was to build a company selling personal computer software, a plan that was nicely carried out by Steve Jobs and later by Bill Gates. I was not able to get leverage, partly because I couldn't persuade anybody to help me because I didn't have a computer science degree, blah, blah, blah. Also, you see, I had a director's attitude. And that's still culturally unacceptable in the computer world. They say, well, programmers, they're the designers. Nah, come on. Very few programmers can design systems for people. It's entirely different. It's entirely different ability. And the director is not acknowledged, except at Pixar. But most computer companies do not see, most computer projects are run in this herding cats mode with nobody taking a strong hand. And this is why they hate Steve Jobs, because he takes a strong hand. And that is why the Macintosh is so well designed and Windows is such a can of worms. Because Steve Jobs takes a very strong hand in the design of his stuff, and Steve Jobs is a movie director. So, not that I use the Macintosh, let me point something else out. Jobs and Gates packaged the existing stuff. They packaged the prevailing paradigm. Hierarchical directories, short file names, programs running on files. Then when Xerox PARC created today's modern GUI, better called the PUI, or PARC User Interface, they added windows and icons and desktop and clipboard. But they were packaging stuff that other people had created. Unfortunately, I was trying to create a different world myself, and have done so, but at great, great cost, and with great, great difficulty because of the problem of getting leverage. I have always thought that the Xanadu product would be ready in 6 months, and that I would be making feature films in 2 years. And that has always been the plan. I never made another plan. I could tell you about the fights and the computer adventures. I'm writing a book called Geeks Bearing Gifts, How the Computer World Got This Way. To counter the myth of technology. By the myth of technology, I mean the myth that IT, information technology, is some sort of relentless force moving with its own steam according to determinate principles. Whereas, in fact, what we see here today, all that crap that's out there, is the result of passions and fights and packaging and conventions, and could be entirely different, except that it isn't. The fact that Microsoft, well, let's look at the history of text systems to take a random example. Not random. By the way, I will tell you my greatest outrage here. This was called cut and paste until 1984. When I learned to write in my teens, the fundamental axiom was writing is mostly rewriting, and rewriting is cut and paste. Meaning, you cut the current version, you lay out the pieces and find a better order. Then you paste them down in that order. Now, I learned this when I was about 15. When I was 19, my first job was at my hometown newspaper called the New York Times. And I was a copy boy. And my first task in the morning was to fill the pots of paste. Yesterday's pot of paste was full of crunchy old white flakes, which had to be scraped out, and I would take it to this vat of gleaming colloid, which I would put in, and the paste pots had a little tube up the center to accommodate the brush. So it was difficult to put the paste in because you had to put into the annular hole around the tube. But that was a matter of pride for me. So I put 2 on the city desk, and I don't remember what the other desks were. And then I'd sit around, and during the day, somebody would yell, "Copy!" Well, first of all, they would type something up. They'd come in, sometimes wearing slouch hats, as in the movies, and type something. And then sometimes they'd just say, "Copy," and I'd put it in the pneumatic tube to the next floor. And sometimes they'd say, "Copy," after they had cut it and pasted it a couple of times. So that's the real cut and paste. Pardon me. Now I have to call it deep rearrange, because in 1984, the Macintosh came out, and they changed the meaning of the words cut and paste. So that cut meant hide this, and paste meant spit out whatever you're hiding wherever you're pointing. And I've actually had Xerox PARC alumni. I have friends from Xerox PARC, but I have rather a negative sentiment about the place. I've had Parkies say to me, "Well, it's the same thing." Isn't it amazing how people can believe metaphysical things? Anyway, this is not the same thing as hide this piece with Control C and Control X and paste this thing with Control V. Not at all. This is a number of strips of paper attached to a backing sheet. And to achieve the same effect, you see, the problem is being able to see all the pieces at once. The parallel viewing of all the portions of your work, one of the higher functions of the human mind, rather than hide and plug, as represented by these 2 functions. But why do they call it that then? They called it because they created this abominable mechanism called the clipboard, and to justify it, they gave it the name clipboard. See, it's just like an ordinary clipboard, except you can't see it. It only holds one thing, and when you put something on it, it destroys the previous contents. In every other way, it's exactly like a physical clipboard, except there aren't any other respects. So this is pure propaganda to make you accept this abominable mechanism. And so then they called the functions of it copy, cut and paste, to make it seem as though somehow it was replacing a previous function, which it does not do, and you cannot get software that allows you to do that. Now, I found I use TextPad pulling from one version to another, which doesn't do the same thing because it does not give you the overview. You want to be able to shrink the text, zoom in around, crawl around, and pull it across. Okay. End of that sermon. So here is the history of text systems from my point of view. Make that a little larger. Right. Sorry about the cruddy slide. I did this in Leipzig last week. There are basically 4 people I'd like you to note. Doug Engelbart, myself, John Siebold, and Bob Taylor. Right. So Doug Engelbart is the great visionary of the computer field. In 1957, he had his great epiphany. By the way, both Doug and I read an article called As We May Think, which was published in 1945 by Vannevar Bush, who was the President Roosevelt's science advisor. And Bush talked about what he called the Memex, which would be a box that would hold all of mankind's writings. And of course, it would all fit in microfilm under your desk. But you'd be able to make trails of the different significant objects and side trails commenting on them. And Doug was inspired by this, and I think I was inspired by it. But since it came out when I was 8, I'm not dead sure. Now, it has been taken as the beginning of hypertext. Well, I won't get to that one. Okay, so I should have had that up here. So Doug Engelbart was thinking about all these things, and in 1957 he had a vision of people being able to share work on screens, share documents on screens, and he saw this as, quote, raising collective IQ, meaning the ability of people to work together because the whole group is smarter. Whereas I've always believed that the IQ of a group was less than the IQ of any person. But he, at Stanford Research Institute, not part of Stanford University, he got grants from this guy, Bob Taylor. He got grants and built something called NLS, which stood for Online System. He invented, as everyone knows, the mouse. But that was only for one hand. In the other hand, using Doug's system, under the other hand, you had a 5-finger keyboard. So Doug still works on his NLS system with a mouse in one hand and the 5-finger and typing with the other seamlessly, not having to move to a regular keyboard, regular QWERTY keyboard. Unfortunately, well, we'll see what happened. So I had my ideas in 1960, which were entirely different. I came up with the word hypertext about here in 1963. But to me, it meant something very different from what is now called hypertext. It meant being able to buckle documents side by side. It meant marginalia. It meant publishing mechanisms, an entire suite. I believe you can have the paperless office. It's a commonplace joke that, oh no, you can't have the paperless office like the paperless toilet, oh no. But anyone who compares an office to a toilet shouldn't be designing software. The point is, I believe you can have a paperless office, but not if you imitate paper. Get it? If you imitate paper, it's hopeless. It's totally inferior to the way things are now. And, oh my. Okay, so the third party of special interest is John W. Siebold. John was a Quaker, and he also a fellow Swarthmore graduate. He was a peacemaker. Quakers are peacemakers, and they know how to find the good in everyone, and John was a very nice man, and was a labor negotiator, and worked more and more in the printing and publishing industry, and got to know that. After which, in 1963, he visited a printing plant in Florida, and he had his epiphany, which was that you could typeset by computer. Because up to this time, everything had to be re-typeset every time. Every time you wanted to publish a Bible in a different font, it had to be keyed in again. And he naturally saw something wrong with that. And he created a company called ROCAPI in the 60s. Stood for research, I think, Research on Computer Applications in Printing Publishing Industry. And became the, essentially, honcho of fonts. Now over here is Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor was at ARPA, which was the Defense Department Advanced Research Projects. The Defense Department was basically what the Army wanted, what the Navy wanted, what the Air Force wanted, and ARPA. So those three services had their own missions in mind and were fighting with each other, ARPA was supposed to look ahead